In August 2013, Matthew Barrett wrote an article entitled, "Dear Pastor, Bring Your Bible to Church." This is the article that was published by the Gospel Coalition, referenced by Colin Hansen in last week's episode. According to Colin, it may very well be the article that made TGC's readership the angriest. He said the Facebook comments were very strong. This is episode 12 of Digital Christianity, Rejecting and Redeeming Technology. About 5 years ago, I remember sitting in the local church I attend and noticing one of our church's ruling elders sitting in front of me. At some point during the sermon, he pulled out his phone and started responding to and deleting emails. Now, this is a good man who loves the Lord. I'm absolutely convinced of that, but it was troubling to see this. Since this moment, phones out during a sermon are all too common. I see it all the time, and I'm sure you do as well. Without a doubt, if we removed the phones from the service altogether, our minds would still wander and would be drawn to distraction. That said, the lack of concern over this habit of many churchgoers should sober anyone seeking to worship their Savior wholeheartedly. Another concern with technology moves from the sanctuary to the classroom.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Lovely to be here. I'm going to start with a slender anecdote, totally true, from about 4 weeks ago. It was early evening, and I was on a packed 19 bus in London, standing over a young man and a young woman. They were sitting beside each other, both gazing at their smartphones. Nothing unusual about this, of course. They were both attractive, smartly dressed, professional-looking, around the same age. Willfully invading their privacy, I subtly angled myself to see what they were up to on their phones. They were each on dating apps, reading the profiles of men and women who presented as extremely similar to the two of them. Completely true. Our bus reached Piccadilly Circus, and both happened to alight at this stop. I watched the two of them as they walked away from each other, one towards Shaftesbury Avenue and the other towards St James's. I don't need to labour the point of what I witnessed with this couple never to be. They were side by side, both seeking companionship or love, but they didn't even register each other's existence. Social media is described as a great connecting force, and it can be a wonderful thing. But when we stop noticing people in our immediate surroundings in favour of the swirling masses online, I don't think of it in quite such a warm, fuzzy glow. Whether it's my young couple from the bus, teens alone in their bedrooms glued to hours of futile or dangerous rubbish, parents scrolling on their phones while their babies try in vain to catch their eye, or toddlers given Siri voice companions in nurseries. None of these newly acquired habits seem to bode well for our collective spiritual flourishing. The disintegration of adult society and the loneliness of our elderly population is bleak enough, but the digital destruction of childhood is a crisis we must face if we're to have an alliance of remotely functioning citizens, let alone responsible ones.
This is Sophie Winkleman speaking at an event hosted by the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. You heard Patrick Miller talk about addiction in episode 9. He also published an article at TGC entitled "Why Christian Parents Should Resist School-Issued Screens." The link to the full article can be found in the show notes, but here's Patrick speaking to his concerns.
Yeah, so it's ironic for a guy who spends a lot of my time using and deploying digital technology to say that as a school board member at my daughter's private school, I have been the most antagonistic towards allowing screens and technology into the building. I am one reason, not the only, that in our K through 8th grade, we do not have screens. Kids aren't given school-issued iPads. They're not given school-issued laptops or devices. We have a computer lab so they can go learn how to use a computer there. But outside of that, they don't have them. And this is for a number of reasons. But I'll begin with a story. A friend of mine who has his kids in public schools, his kid gets into middle school. And in our public schools, that's when they're given an iPad that they're allowed to take home. Prior to that, they can have iPads in the classroom. But in middle school, it's your device. You can take it around wherever you want. And as you can imagine, for an 11-year-old, this is really exciting. You know, I've got this Apple technology. I can look at whatever I want to. But my friend's a responsible dad. So when his son gets home, he takes the iPad up to his room and he sees if he can access pornography using the iPad. And within a period of 3 minutes, he found pornography.
Mm.
So he goes back to the school. He says, hey, your filter isn't working. It must be something that's set up wrong. Could you fix my son's iPad? And they take it and they say, yeah, something's wrong here. We'll fix it. They fix it. They give it back to him. And he says, hey, before I leave, I want to make sure that this is working. Within another 3 minutes, he's able to access pornography. And it's at this point that the media personnel inside of the building admit that they can't really filter things out. In fact, kids have been finding pornography or having pornographic ads supplied onto their YouTube watching other platforms for years now. And he says, well, that's strange. I've never heard this before. Why haven't you told anyone? They said, well, we just deal with this on a case-by-case basis as we hear about it. In other words, the only way a parent would find out that their child had access to pornography is either one, to catch them using it, or two, be responsible and look for it themselves. And I think a lot of parents, because they have high trust in schools, wouldn't even think to do that. They would just assume these school filters are working. The school district, meanwhile, is doing nothing to change it. And so this is just one small example of how having screens in schools can lead to addictive patterns in children's lives that have lifelong ramifications. As I heard these stories, I started doing more research, and it became absolutely evident to me that there is virtually no research that shows that having screens in classrooms, especially before high school, does anything to improve the educational process. In fact, almost every study shows the opposite. If you have a learning disability, screens harm you more than other people. If you are someone who comes from a broken family or you have poverty, screens harm you more than other people. Screens have been shown to harm educational outcomes. Virtually anything you would care about in schools, screens go against it. The problem is, back in the 2010s, no one knew that this was the case, so we made our kids into guinea pigs. And as the information is coming out, media officials in schools aren't sharing about it because their jobs rely upon them being blind to it. And so this is why it's really important for Christians with love and kindness and generosity to be in the forefront of parents who are saying, we don't want screens in our schools. We want education in our schools. I link out to articles from the New York Times, from various educational research institutions, for one reason. Giving an article from a Christian website to your secular school is probably not going to win anyone over. But there is so much research out there. I link to all of it that I could find that you can bring to the teachers and say, hey, here's what's going on. And I also want to say this. Most teachers aren't for screens in the classroom. In fact, most people inside that building aren't for screens in the classroom. They see how detrimental it is to education, but they don't have any power to change it. And so again, I think it's just really important to be careful about assuming that you're dealing with enemies. You might be dealing with people who have no idea about the ramification of screens. You might be dealing with people who agree with you that we shouldn't have screens. It's really a very, very narrow portion of any school building that has any awareness of how destructive these things are, who need to be maybe convinced to change their perspective. In my experience, most people are very open to hearing from parents' perspectives, and there are parents across the country who are pushing against this and seeing some tremendous change.
Now, these are serious concerns we should be sobered by. Screens distracting us from worshiping God and screens hindering the young minds of students. However, screens aren't simply going to disappear. As parents and youth leaders, how can we help our children and students reject certain aspects of screens and redeem other aspects as well? Here's Jen Pollock-Michelle speaking about her son as an aspiring YouTuber. As a reminder, she references the late influencer Dave Hollis and the dangers of performing in the world of social media.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, I was like, oh, this is it's interesting to be in this context for youth ministry. And I have a son who is kind of an aspiring YouTuber. And so I think navigating these things as a parent too is very challenging, because you, on the one hand, you want to just sort of say, like, I know what's best, and, don't fiddle with that silly stuff. And being in conversation, I feel like the Hollis story for me, just to kind of return us to the beginning, was a good way to talk to my son about the burdens of performativity And I have daughters too. The Anxious Generation with Jonathan Haidt is just such an important book about how, the aesthetics of social media, how it's affecting our daughters. I have 2 daughters. I have 3 sons. I think it's affecting them all very differently. And I also think that there's even this kind of generational gap, because you have 5 kids and there's this age gap. We have one who was born in 2001, and then our twins born in 2008. Like, it just feels like even that 7-year span where they hit puberty and what was available to them was just all very different, especially like our younger twins. And so I think I just want to say, like, it's easy for me to sort of talk theoretically, talk about, like, at this high level, like, ideas about, some of the dangers, the temptations, but they're so real for our kids. And it's, they can't opt out, I guess I should say, in exactly the way that we can. And I'll just like add one little Postman nugget here, which I think is one of the most critical things to understand about his work, is he says, technological change is not additive. It's not like we got Instagram and we added something, or we got the smartphone and we added something, or now we have AI and we add something. That's the wrong way to think about technological change. You want to think about it as ecological. And maybe Reed even talked about this. It's environmental change. It doesn't mean that our tools change. It means that our whole environment, our whole context changes. And so I'm very much speaking from a context of, like, I'm 50, I'm not speaking from a context of, I'm 16. And I think that the more that we can, like, get into the minds and understand what are the real pressures and obligations, I would even say, of social media for our teenagers, because, like, if you opt out, like, you won't know anything, in some cases. And so these are I guess I would just want to say, I think the conversation is very generational, but the way that we can have that conversation is to try to understand what's happening environmentally, not just what tool do I give or refuse, to my child, but man, what's the water that they're swimming in? And I think this book will be really fantastic for that.
Hi, I'm Joe Deegan with RYM Worship, and I wanted to take a moment to tell you about our brand new worship album called Faithful and True that will be coming out later this spring. RYM Worship exists to serve the church and to help provide music for youth groups to listen to and sing together. And we are very excited for the opportunity to share more music with you. This album will consist of 5 familiar hymns and worship songs, as well as 5 original songs that I've written over the past couple years. And per usual, we will be posting all the chord charts on RYM's website for free so that anyone can go and play these songs. So we hope that this music is a blessing to you, and we are excited to share it with you very soon. So stay tuned.
The tension we hear with Jen is real for any of the parents listening. We lament so much related to screens, and we must be responsible to steward our children's interactions with screens. But what do we do with future generations of teenagers seeking to use the platform for good? Let's return to Sophie Winkleman again.
I first became interested in the topic of screens and children a few years ago when I was made patron of the education charity School Home Support. I visited schools up and down the country, and too often I saw children distracted in classrooms, yet silent in playgrounds. Screens were taking their attention away from their teachers during lessons and away from each other during break time. I also observed children in general becoming a different species. The raucous exuberance of youth was being replaced with an anxious, irritable insularity, which was disturbing to see. From a personal point of view, I know that if I'd had devices in and out of the classroom, I would have bombed academically. I'd have been constantly distracted, thrilled by all the garbage available online. I wouldn't have read any books, and I'd have got up to goodness knows what on my various machines. Our household landline was quite derailing enough. Looking back, I cherish the very analog form of education that I received and the very human connection with my beloved teachers. It's been one of the greatest gifts of my life, and I want all children to be able to focus, to acquire knowledge, and to achieve their maximum potential. I think that should be every civilized society's aim. But the evidence shows that we have already put this gravely at risk. We left the doors to our children's classrooms, their bedrooms, and their minds wide open to the world. Perhaps we thought we were giving children the right to access everything which might be good out there, but instead we've given everyone else, the good and the bad, access to our children. Let's consider some facts and figures. As illustrated in Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, the great rewiring of childhood is causing a plague of mental illness in our children. In the decade up to 2020, the suicide rate for younger teens increased by 167% among girls and 91% among boys. Hospital admissions for children with eating disorders in the UK have risen sixfold in a decade, the contagious influence of social media cited as a major factor. And 2022 saw a 500% increase of self-harming among teens over the past 9 years. In a British study last year, researchers found that 1 in 3 children are now short-sighted. Myopia is predicted to affect nearly 1 billion children around the world by 2050. Too much screen time is the culprit, with blue light harming developing eyes, not to mention interfering with children's hormones and their sleep rhythms. Spending time outside can be preventative for myopia, yet screens suck children indoors more than in any previous generation. Recently, the technology regulator Ofcom reported that 1/4 of British children under the age of 7 have a smartphone, increasing to 97% of 12-year-olds. This mass buy-in to smartphones is resulting in a lost and deeply damaged childhood, with screen addiction displacing nearly every wholesome activity you can think of. As Douglas Gentile puts it, time spent on screens is time not spent elsewhere. A healthy childhood should involve lots of free fun, drawing, running, reading, writing stories, make-believe, kicking a football around, even just staring out of the window and wondering. These are all halcyon images in a sepia tint because they scarcely happen anymore. Health professionals for safer screens recently issued guidance that 11 to 17-year-olds should have no more than 1 to 2 hours screen time per day. This includes everything: iPads, school laptops, smartphones. It's all just screen time to the brain. And yet, children aged 8 to 18 are on average spending 7.5 hours per day on screens outside of school hours. Out and about, the reality is starkly visible. The number of toddlers subdued by screens on public transport when they'd be perfectly happy looking at the strangers around them, the dogs on leads, the opening and closing doors, is to my mind tragic. This unthinking crossover from the analog to the digital is resulting in heavily impaired speech, cognitive development, and emotional regulation. How will children so constantly but artificially stimulated ever learn to think, imagine, create, or just be still? The short answer is that they won't. Excessive consumption of screen-based technologies is damaging developing brains in ways too seismic yet to fully comprehend. The battle on the smartphone front is being waged with ever more power, thanks in no small part to Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt, who've established that the harms of a front-facing camera, addictive social media platforms, and 24/7 dopamine ignition are incontestable. From the damage to focus, to self-esteem, to deep thinking, to the ability to read books, to be patient, to sleep well, to interact healthily in real life, to think of others as opposed to one's own brand, to pure opportunity cost, the list is relentless. And these harms are at the more minor end of the spectrum. The enhanced facilitation of knife crime, the enticement to radicalization and terrorism, and the repulsively violent porn, these horrors are globally recognized, yet still readily available on children's phones.
As Sophie said, we left the doors to our children's classrooms, their bedrooms, and their minds wide open to the world. We've given the good and the bad of the world complete access to our children. We all know there was a point in time when the research was limited and in many cases non-existent in reference to potential harms of screens on young brains, but that isn't the case anymore, especially in the classrooms. Our lamenting makes some of us long for an existence like the one depicted in M. Night Shyamalan's 2004 movie, The Village, which tells the story of a group of people who seek to isolate themselves from the evils of the world, only to discover that evils are in their own hearts. Oftentimes, when someone seeks to push back on technology, they're either labeled a Luddite who just hates technology altogether, or viewed as someone seeking to live like the Amish. Although Dr. Reed Schuchardt critiques the Amish, he also admires aspects of their lifestyle. As he talks about his daily routines that seek to help him remain embodied, he also begins talking about the Amish community.
I mean, it's a good thing to go through like a daily regimen and say, what is your actual daily habit? So I wake up with my wife, and I start the fire or start the kettle for tea. And then I take a shower, and then we have tea together on the couch and either read together or pray together or both. And then I greet my children as they wake up. We feed them. Then I get ready for work, head off to work. And if it's good weather, I ride my bike with my son, who shares the path to work with me. And so he rides his bike. If it's bad weather, like today, it was cold, we drove our cars. But we live as close to campus as we can, which in this case is 1.8 miles away. I try to have my students print out their papers in hard copy and not submit them digitally on the online learning management system. In other words, I try to embody and mirror and model embodiment in kind of almost all the places where I can, and try to invite students into that same embodiment. And I'm constantly making the connection for them and trying to make the point that is the actual story of the gospel, that God was a spirit, was a concept, was an idea out there. And in order to make himself known and real to us in the truest and deepest sense, he had to come in person. Only through the embodiment of God in Christ that we actually have a savior. And that's the greatest story ever told. That's the actual story of the world. And so if you're a Christian, right, it's a highly ironic and paradoxical problem to think you can transmit the gospel of embodiment through the medium of disembodiment. And I think the two metrics that I think are the most valuable and relevant for Christian sustenance and transmission of the gospel to the next generation is the number of children you have and the retention rate of your religious tradition. And that's why I point out that the Danner or Andy Holmes Weaver Amish of Holmes County, Ohio, have a 95 to 97% retention rate. And that's astonishing because Catholics have like a 50% rate and Protestants have like a 45% and lower rate of retention for their religious traditions. But the Amish not only have average family size of 10, but they also have a 95 to 97% retention rate. And so it's fascinating to me that the Christians that are doing this thing the most successfully are the specific group of people who have categorically answered the questions of what do we do about technology? And so I'm not Amish and I can't become Amish and I don't really like horses, but I can certainly appreciate and try to, use their standard of success as a measurement against which I measure my own actions in life. And, more and more I think, wow, the Amish actually answered a lot of these questions long ago before I even started thinking about them. And so I'm much more impressed than I was. I used to think of the Amish as people that had withdrawn from and abandoned the culture and were not actually fulfilling the gospel. And when you realize that, 1 out of 5 Christians is made by conversion and 4 out of 5 Christians are made by birth rate and being raised in a Christian home, then you realize, the Amish method is actually the higher ROI method, i.e. they have an 80% return on investment and the rest of us have a 20% return on investment. And so it's just a math question at that point. And so I do think the more you look into some of these questions, the more you discover, wait a minute, I haven't thought about this deeply enough. So I'm still struggling and trying to figure out how to best live my life in a digital world. And it's too late at age 56 to try to persuade my family to, become Amish. And I wouldn't, even if I could, even if they would follow me in that, that's not something I would actually seek to do or desire to do, because I literally don't have the skill set or the patience or the tolerance for it. And there's certain things about the Amish that I couldn't abide. One of them is they don't read fiction. And I'm like, well, how would you live if you couldn't have Narnia and Middle Earth, you know? So there's a lot of, you know, other reasons I'm not Amish. And yet I think Christians have a lot to learn by looking at how have they answered these questions, because I think they've been thinking about them for at least 300 years longer than most of us have.
I appreciated a lot of what Reed said and was humbled by his comments about the Amish community. I don't know about you, but I often give a dismissive chuckle towards their lifestyle. But as Reed pointed out, they've been thinking about many concerns surrounding technology for somewhere around 300 years longer than what we have. That truth alone should give us humility and grace to see what we might be able to reject and redeem from them as well. Next week, we'll begin to think more about rest, and we'll also talk with someone who's developed a new technology to help us resist the addiction of our devices. We'll also hear how groups of churches are participating in something called the digital fast. You've been listening to Digital Christianity by Reformed Youth Ministries. For more information about our summer conferences, youth leader training, and resources, visit rym.org. If you would take the time to leave a positive review and share this podcast with others, it's one small way to help our ministry. Stay tuned to the RYM podcast for more great content that seeks to serve the church in her efforts to reach and equip youth for Christ.